So this is a breakdown of how I took a piece of scrap wood that I had lying around and made it into an epoxy board for a good friend of mine. So first thing that I had to do was kind of fashion a sort of like cradle that would be able to hold the board and the epoxy content without spilling out. So right now what I'm doing is I'm measuring out the pieces and then creating the cradle by putting a tuck tape so that it'll be easy to remove later. So the tuck tape process is probably like the longest process of actually creating the cradle, but it's necessary for you to be having easy removal. I've seen some people use aluminum tape. I didn't have aluminum tape handy, so I just used the tuck tape. So it worked out pretty well. The biggest part of this is just drilling some of the more permanent pieces in, and then adding tape, and then finally adding a silicone bead around. After the silicone bead is added, then you're able to add the board and then stabilize it. So another thing that I'm doing here is I'm adding a couple of extra clamp type pieces so that I can push the board down with my clamps later and then just stabilize that so that the board doesn't float away whenever I add the epoxy. And there's the silicone bead. So now we move on to mixing the epoxy. Here I'm using a cobalt blue and a blue-green mixture, and then I'm measuring them out in 2 separate cups so that I can add them later whenever they go against each other, and you'll see that here in a second. So just mix diligently. It's recommended 3 to 5 minutes, but once you're comfortable with the amount of mixture, then it's pretty much done. And the powder, you don't need to add a lot to get the color that you actually want. These black diamond powders are really good about that. Alright, so to begin with, I pour a cup here, and then I pour the other contrasting cup on the other side. And then I do this a few more times until I get the levels of epoxy all the way slightly above the board. So some people use a separator, but because the colors are so different, they blend in very nicely. And that was kind of like the goal that I had for this one. So just blending them in. So here I use a little stick to swirl them around. So once it's complete, all the way to the top, I use a torch to bust any little bubbles that I see forming. I let it sit there for about 15 minutes before I actually start the torch so the bubbles can float to the top. But this was a constant process for the next couple of days of adding a couple of flames. So what I did after I removed the board is I added a couple of beads of silicone to keep some epoxy encased, and then I filled in the remaining holes. And there I am sanding away the silicone and additional epoxy that formed up on the top of the board. And once I'm done with that, I take the board and I square it up as best as I can, and then remove any excess silicone that's stuck to the sides of the board using the table saw. Once I'm comfortable with the square, clean up the area, and then that part is done. Now I'm taking the board through a planer, and that removes and smooths out the majority of the board on both sides until I'm comfortable with how it evens out. And this process is by far the messiest of all of them. And then my buddy wanted a couple of handles at the end, so I was able to route a couple of grooves in there so you can easily grip them without adding any extra hardware onto the board. And the last part is just adding the mineral oil.